High above the vast and endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the drone of a radial engine roared against the wind. It was the 4th of June in the year 1942. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McClusky looked down from his cockpit with eyes burning from fatigue and the glare of the tropical sun. His fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and the tension in the air was palpable. He led a squadron of dauntless dive bombers from the aircraft carrier Enterprise searching for a Japanese fleet that seemed to have vanished into the mist. The fate of the American Navy, and perhaps the entire war, rested on their ability to find the enemy before their tanks ran dry. The silence of the ocean below belied the deadly game of cat and mouse playing out across thousands of square miles of open water. Beneath the rolling waves and scattered clouds, the most powerful armada ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy was moving with calculated precision toward the tiny Midway atoll. Their mission was to draw the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet into a final decisive battle that would annihilate American naval power forever. For the pilots in the air, the ocean looked empty, but they knew that somewhere beneath them lay the Kaido Butai, the strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor only 6 months prior. Suddenly, the blue monotony was broken by a white streak cutting through the water like a scar. It was the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming at full speed to rejoin its main fleet. Clarence Wade McClusky made a sharp decision that would alter the course of history. He banked his wing and signaled his squadron to follow the destroyer's path. Minutes ticked by like hours as the fuel gauges dropped lower. Then on the horizon, black specks appeared, turning into the distinct shapes of warships. There they were. The 4 great aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were revealed, basking in the sunlight, unaware of the doom descending from the clouds. The heavy, dauntless dive bombers rolled over and began their screaming descent toward the unsuspecting ships below. The wind rushed past the canopies as the altimeters unwound with dizzying speed. Anti-aircraft fire began to erupt from the surface, blossoming into black puffs of deadly smoke around the diving planes. The Japanese carriers were cluttered with aircraft on their flight decks, fueling and arming for a strike against the American fleet. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. The American pilots held their dives, steady, fighting the G-forces and the terror of the flak aiming for the red circles painted on the yellow flight decks. In a span of just a few chaotic minutes, the course of the Pacific War shifted violently. Bombs released from the American planes struck home with devastating precision. The Japanese aircraft carriers Akagikaga and Soryu were turned into infernos as the American bombs ignited fully fueled planes and piles of ordnance on their decks. The roar of explosions tore through the steel hulls, and the pride of the Imperial Navy was consumed by fire. This was the climax of the Battle of Midway, a clash of titans that proved the aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship as the supreme weapon of naval warfare. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must look back to the dark days following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States was reeling from the surprise strike that had crippled its battleship fleet. The Imperial Japanese Navy reigned supreme across the Pacific, conquering territory after territory with seemingly unstoppable momentum. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun flag flew over a rapidly expanding empire. The American public was gripped by fear and a thirst for revenge, while military leaders scrambled to rebuild their defenses and formulate a strategy to halt the Japanese advance before it reached the majestic shores of the West Coast. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, knew that the United States possessed immense industrial potential. He understood that a prolonged war would favor the Americans, so he sought a quick and decisive victory to force a negotiated peace. His plan was bold and complex. He would attack Midway Atoll, a small but strategic outpost located roughly halfway between North America and Asia. By threatening this vital base, he intended to lure the American aircraft carriers out from Pearl Harbor and into a trap where they could be overwhelmed and destroyed by his superior numbers. The stakes could not have been higher for the United States Navy. With only a handful of operational aircraft carriers and a fleet of support ships that was significantly outnumbered, defeat at Midway would have been catastrophic. It would have left Hawaii vulnerable to invasion and forced the American fleet to retreat to the California coast. The Pacific Ocean would have effectively become a Japanese lake, allowing them to cut off supply lines to Australia and dictate the terms of the war. The survival of the United States as a Pacific power hung in the balance. However, the Americans possessed a secret weapon that Yamamoto had not accounted for. In a basement at Pearl Harbor, a team of brilliant codebreakers and linguists worked around the clock in a windowless room known as Station Hypo. Led by the eccentric and driven commander Joseph Rochefort, these men analyzed fragments of Japanese radio traffic, searching for patterns in the noise. They discovered references to a target designated as AF. Rochefort was convinced that AF was Midway, but his superiors in Washington disagreed, believing the attack would come in the Aleutian Islands or elsewhere. To prove his theory, Joseph Rochefort devised a clever ruse. He instructed the garrison at Midway to broadcast a false message in plain language, stating that their water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, the codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was identified. The target was indeed Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Admiral Chester William Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, made a daring decision to send his 3 available carriers to ambush the Japanese force. Admiral Chester William Nimitz was a man of quiet confidence and steel resolve. While others might have played it safe, he chose to gamble everything on the element of surprise. He ordered the carriers Enterprise and Hornet to sail immediately toward a rendezvous point northeast of Midway dubbed Point Luck. The third carrier, the Yorktown, had been badly damaged in the previous Battle of the Coral Sea. Estimates suggested it would take 3 months to repair her, but Nimitz ordered the work done in 3 days. Civilian workers swarmed the ship, welding and patching around the clock to get her sea ready. The miracle of the Yorktown repairs was a testament to American grit and determination. She sailed out of Pearl Harbor with workmen still on board, trailing the other 2 carriers to join the coming fight. The American force was designated Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. They were outnumbered in every category, from battleships to cruisers to aircraft. Yet they had the advantage of knowing where and when the enemy would arrive. They positioned themselves to the northeast of Midway, lying in wait for the Japanese fleet to reveal itself. On the Japanese side, the mood was one of supreme confidence bordering on arrogance. The Kaido Butai, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, sailed under radio silence, shielded by rain and fog. They believed the Americans were unaware of their presence and that the American carriers were still anchored at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese plan relied on complex coordination between multiple battle groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. They expected to soften up Midway with an air strike and then crush the American fleet when it inevitably rushed to the rescue. As the sun rose on the morning of June 4th, the Japanese launched their first wave of aircraft against Midway Atoll. Over 100 planes, including Zero fighters and Naval dive bombers, roared into the sky. At the same time, American scout planes were combing the horizon, desperate to spot the enemy first. The report finally came in, crackling over the radio. Enemy carriers sighted. The message electrified the American command. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, immediately ordered his carriers to launch every available aircraft. The Japanese strike force pummeled the facilities on Midway, causing significant damage, but failing to knock out the airfield. As the Japanese planes returned to their carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical dilemma. His scout planes had not yet reported any American ships in the area. He believed he had time to rearm his reserve aircraft with bombs for a second strike on the island. The flight decks of the Akagi and Kaga became a hive of activity as crews frantically switched torpedoes for land attack bombs. Suddenly, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone sent a delayed report. It had spotted American ships but did not identify a carrier. Nagumo paused. If there were American ships nearby, his current loadout of land bombs would be useless against armored vessels. He ordered the rearming to stop and then to switch back to torpedoes. Confusion reigned in the hangars as heavy ordnance was carted back and forth. Then the scout plane confirmed the presence of an American carrier. Nagumo was caught off balance, his decks cluttered with fuel and explosives. Before the Japanese could launch a coordinated attack against the American fleet, the first waves of American planes arrived. These were the torpedo bombers, the Devastators, flying low and slow above the water. They had become separated from the dive bombers and fighters and arrived without protection. The Japanese Zero fighters flying combat air patrol swooped down on them like hawks. The slaughter was horrific. One by one, the American torpedo planes were shot down, crashing into the sea in balls of fire. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber squadrons was heartbreaking, but not in vain. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was almost completely wiped out, with only one man surviving the attack. Their low-level approach drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to just above the waves, leaving the skies above the carriers temporarily undefended. The Japanese gunners and fighter pilots were fixated on the torpedo threat, unaware that high above them, the American dive bombers were arriving at that very moment. It was at this precise juncture that Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McClusky and his squadron from the Enterprise arrived over the target area. Simultaneously, the Yorktown dive bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie approached from a different direction. It was a perfect accidental coordination. The Japanese carriers were caught in a vulnerable transition, with planes on deck fueling and rearming. The Zero fighters were too low to intercept the high-altitude threat. The sky was open for the Americans. The dive bombers peeled off into their attacks. The sound of the wind screaming over their wings was deafening as they plummeted toward the ships. The Japanese lookouts screamed warnings, but it was too late. The first bombs smashed into the flight deck of the Kaga, exploding among the parked aircraft and fuel lines. A massive fireball erupted, consuming the bridge and the hangars below. The flagship Akagi was next. A bomb penetrated her deck and detonated in the hangar, causing a chain reaction of explosions that doomed the vessel. Within minutes, the Saryu was also hit. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning fiercely, their crews fighting a losing battle against the Infernos. The suddenness of the destruction was shocking. The most powerful naval force on Earth had been crippled in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. The strategic balance of the Pacific War had swung violently in favor of the United States. The invincible Kaido Butai was broken. However, the battle was not yet over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Huryu, was still operational and undetected. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the Huryu, launched an immediate counterstrike. His pilots were elite veterans, and they followed the returning American planes back to their fleet. They found the Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers scored 3 hits on the American carrier, slowing her down and causing heavy smoke. The American damage control teams worked miracles, extinguishing the fires and patching the deck, allowing the Yorktown to resume flight operations. But the Japanese were relentless. A second wave of torpedo bombers from the Huryu attacked the Yorktown, believing it to be a different carrier because the fires had been put out so effectively. 2 torpedoes slammed into her side, tearing open the hull and cutting power. The great ship listed heavily to port, and the order was given to abandon ship. Men slid down ropes into the oily water as destroyers moved in to rescue the crew. The Yorktown had absorbed the fury of the Japanese counterattack, saving her sister ships Enterprise and Hornet. Back on the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance was determined to finish the job. Scout planes located the Huryu late in the afternoon. A mixed strike force of orphans, planes from the sunken Yorktown, and the other carriers was launched into the setting sun. They found the Huryu racing to escape. The American dive bombers descended once more. 4 bombs struck the last Japanese carrier, sealing her fate. The Huryu was engulfed in flames, joining her 3 sisters in destruction. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his battleship, the Yamato, hundreds of miles away, was stunned by the reports. He initially considered engaging the American fleet with his surface ships in a night battle, but realized that without air cover his battleships would be sitting ducks when the sun rose. With a heavy heart, he ordered a general retreat. The invasion of Midway was canceled. The unstoppable tide of Japanese expansion had been broken. The retreat was not without further loss for the Japanese. Two heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Megami, collided in the confusion of the night while trying to avoid a submarine. The damaged ships were spotted the next day by American planes. The Mikuma was pounded by wave after wave of bombers until she sank, while the Megami limped away heavily damaged. The victory was total. The United States had lost one carrier and a destroyer, while Japan had lost 4 carriers and a heavy cruiser. Beyond the loss of ships, the Battle of Midway inflicted a devastating toll on the Japanese Naval Aviation Corps. Hundreds of their best pilots and highly trained aircraft mechanics were killed. These were men who could not be easily replaced. The Japanese training program was rigid and slow, unable to churn out skilled aviators at the rate needed to sustain a war of attrition. The Americans, conversely, were ramping up a massive training pipeline that would produce thousands of capable pilots in the years to come. The battle demonstrated the decisive role of naval air power. The era of the battleship as the queen of the sea was over. The aircraft carrier, with its ability to project power over hundreds of miles, had become the new capital ship. Commanders learned that seeing the enemy first and striking first was the key to victory. The lessons learned at Midway would shape naval doctrine for the rest of the 20th century. It was a victory of intelligence, strategy, and sheer courage. For the United States, the victory at Midway was a tremendous morale booster. It proved that the Japanese military machine was not invincible. It secured the safety of Hawaii and the West Coast, allowing the American industrial giant to fully mobilize for war. Shipyards across the nation began to churn out new Essex-class carriers by the dozen ships that would eventually overwhelm the Japanese Navy. The initiative had passed to the Allies, and they would never relinquish it. The story of Midway is also a story of individual heroism. Men like John Waldron, who led his torpedo squadron into certain death. Men like Dusty Kless and Dick Best, who placed their bombs with pinpoint accuracy. And men like Joseph Rochefort, whose intellect and intuition provided the opportunity for victory. Their actions on those critical days in June changed the world. They faced overwhelming odds, and through their sacrifice, they preserved freedom for future generations. Admiral Chester William Nimitz would later say that Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. The ability to read the enemy's mail gave the weaker American force the leverage it needed. But intelligence alone does not win battles. It requires the skill and bravery of those at the tip of the spear to convert information into action. The pilots and crewmen of the Pacific Fleet delivered that action in abundance, turning a trap into a triumph. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the strategic landscape had been transformed. The Japanese were forced onto the defensive, trying to hold onto their vast perimeter against an increasingly powerful American foe. The road to Tokyo would still be long and bloody, filled with brutal island-hopping campaigns. But the threat of a Japanese victory in the Pacific had been extinguished. The rising sun had reached its zenith and was now beginning its slow descent. Today, the waters around Midway Atoll are quiet. The wrecks of the Kaga Akagi, Soryu, Huryu, and Yorktown lie miles deep in the darkness of the abyss. They are silent monuments to the ferocity of the battle and the thousands of men who died there. The Battle of Midway remains a case study in military academies around the world, teaching the importance of adaptability, decisive leadership, and the enduring value of courage under fire. The legacy of Midway endures in the United States Navy of the modern era. The names of the ships and the heroes are honored and remembered. The aircraft carrier remains the centerpiece of American naval power, a direct lineage from the hard-won lessons of 1942. The battle serves as a reminder that in war the difference between victory and defeat often hangs by a thread determined by a few minutes of fate and the actions of a few brave individuals. As we look back on the events of June 1942, we are reminded of the fragility of peace and the terrible cost of war. The Battle of Midway was a crucible that forged the destiny of nations. It stands as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for endurance and valor. The roar of the dauntless engines and the thunder of the explosions have faded into history, but the whisper of time ensures that the memory of those who fought and died will never be forgotten.